have all the way from the West Coast to the US, Bryce Hoffman, who is going to be talking to us about red teaming for resilience. We've been really lucky to actually have Bryce face to face when he spoke in those old days, when he spoke at our breakfast at the end of last year. And I caught up with him in the UK in mid-March before he returned to the US. So I think resilience is something that we've all got to be finding in ourselves, in our teams, a huge amount in the last few weeks, and we'll probably need to dig deeper in the coming months. But to give us a bit of a guide and some of his insights, please a very warm remote welcome to Bryce. Hello.
Hello, thank you, James, and good morning to you all, or good morning from here, good afternoon to you all in the UK. So yes, resilience is obviously a very timely topic. For the past couple of years, I'd say that one of the biggest watchwords in business has been disruption. Well, the reality of the situation is that right now we're all being disrupted. And the question that each of us has to answer as business leaders is, how do we respond to disruption? And what I would submit to you is this: there's only one way you can respond to this. You're going to have to think your way out of it. And what I want to talk to you today about is a way of doing that, using tools and techniques that are really designed to help organizations navigate through this sort of uncertain landscape that we're in now. So what is red team thinking? So here's a little bit of a brief history of red team thinking. It starts on the left here with this gentleman who is probably the best named Pope in history, Pope Pius VI. And Pope Pius VI was the Pope at the beginning of the Renaissance. And he had a problem. His problem was that there were too many saints, and there were new saints being created every month. And just managing the Catholic Church's feast day calendar was becoming a bit unruly. So Pope Sixtus V came up with this idea of let's use a little bit of this new critical thinking that everyone's talking about in Italy, and let's apply it to the process of creating saints. And what he proposed and what he did was he created an office in the Catholic Church. Most people don't realize this is an actual office. It still exists to this day, called the office of the Advocatus Diaboli, the devil's advocate. And this post was filled by a church lawyer, a priest trained in church law, whose job it was to take his team and evaluate every candidate for sainthood and do their best to argue that they weren't saints at all, that their supposed miracles had rational scientific explanations, and their supposed good deeds were really just blatant self-promotion. And guess what happened? The number of new saints being created fell dramatically by well over 90%, and it stayed low to the present day. As I said, this still continues. When Mother Teresa, for instance, was put forward as a candidate for sainthood, the Catholic Church's Office of the Devil's Advocate called the famous atheist Christopher Hitchens to testify against her. Hitchens later complained that A, he failed to persuade them that she wasn't a saint, and B, he wasn't paid for his work, so he had represented the devil pro bono. But this is really the first example of an organization deliberately coming up with a process to deliberately challenge its own thinking, just to basically try to shoot holes in its own ideas. And it's really where this all begins. So I want to jump now to the late 1790s, and the Prussians. They had a very different problem. They had just been beaten by Napoleon, which, if you were a Prussian general, was being defeated by a French corporal was really probably the height of humiliation. And the Prussians were determined not to take this. They were going to figure out how to rebuild their military and take the fight back to Napoleon. And so they came up with this concept of what they called Kriegspiel, which translates into wargaming. And what it was based on was this idea: we're only going to get one chance to try to turn the tables on Napoleon, so we better get it right. So what they decided to do was to divide their best officers into two groups. And one group of officers would play on these tabletop exercises, the Prussians. And the Prussians in those days wore these very spiffy blue uniforms, so they were the blue team. And they were, of course, fighting revolutionary France. So the other half of the officers were going to play the French, and they were the red team. And this is where the term red team and red teaming comes from. But it was also, again, an example of an organization coming up with a process to basically stress test its own strategy before it executed it to increase the odds of it succeeding. I want to jump forward again now to 1973 and the Yom Kippur War in Israel. And Israel had almost lost this war. It was the only war that Israel almost lost, and they came very close to losing it, which is kind of stunning because they should have won it easily because they had more advance warning that they were about to be invaded than any country in history probably has. I won't go into all the details about that, but the thing that's kind of shocking is that they ignored all of the evidence that they were about to be invaded because they believed they knew the mind of their enemy. And what they believed their enemy was doing was bluffing. And they were colossally wrong. And so to make sure they didn't fall victim to this kind of intellectual arrogance in the future, they created this group within Israeli military intelligence called Ipsa Mitsabra, which I'm told in Aramaic translates into, on the contrary, the opposite may be true. This is a very elite unit of intelligence officers that still exists to this day, and their motto is actually based on the British SAS, but instead of he who dares wins, it's he who thinks wins. And the job of this group is to take whatever the prevailing beliefs and views of Israeli intelligence are and argue that the opposite is true, as a way of forcing themselves as an organization to challenge their own assumptions, to challenge their own thinking, and to think differently about the problems that they're dealing with in case they're wrong. So very similarly, the United States had a very colossal failure of intelligence on September 11th, 2001. And in the wake of that, very quickly, literally less than 24 hours after the planes were flown into the Twin Towers in the Pentagon, the CIA evaluated its intelligence and realized that they should have known this was happening. They should have been able to predict this because there's abundant intelligence showing that a terrorist attack using hijacked aircraft was in the offing. And they realized that they had missed it because when they thought about terrorists hijacking planes, they thought about them flying them to Libya or someplace like that and holding them for ransom or blowing them up on the tarmac or something like that. They were bound by their old thinking about what had happened in the past. So again, to force themselves to challenge their own thinking, they did something very similar to the Israelis. They created a group within the CIA called the Red Cell. And the job of the Red Cell was very similar to the Israeli group. It was to challenge the organization's thinking, but where it kind of one-upped the Israelis was the CIA also began developing a series of tools and techniques to do this in a formal and structured way, to force the organization to use contrarian thinking, to force the organization to challenge its own assumptions. So the US military ran into a similar problem a couple years later. In 2004, what had seemed to have been fairly easy victories in Iraq and Afghanistan were rapidly unwinding into kind of colossal stalemates or defeats because of the rising insurgency. And as the US Army in particular began to look at why this happened, why this was happening, they realized that they had made tremendously bad assumptions about what was going to happen after the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And so they created a lessons learned team to make sure that they didn't make these massive strategic blunders in the future. And that led to the process of creating what we now call red teaming, which was a formal process based on all of these things that had come before. The devil's advocate, wargaming, the Israelis, and the CIA Red Cell, to put this all together in a very robust methodology that is designed very simply to help organizations challenge their own plans, their own programs, and their own assumptions. And this is what makes it so powerful and so unique, is this idea of deliberately challenging your own thinking. You know, people often talk about thinking outside the box and but this is a way of doing it in an intentional way using tools designed to help you do that. So what does this have to do with business, and how did I, who've never been in the military, get involved in this? Well, I'm a recovering journalist. I was a business journalist for 22 years. And in 2012, I wrote a book about how Ford Motor Company saved itself during the global financial crisis when the rest of the American automobile industry collapsed. And this book kind of became a manual for CEOs who were trying to transform the culture of their companies. And so I ended up leading journalism and going into management and leadership consulting. And as I was leaving, I had a very interesting conversation with Bill Ford Jr., the great grandson of Henry Ford, and the company's chairman. And I said, Bill, you must be feeling pretty good right now. You're after, just few, short years after you were on the brink of bankruptcy, you're posting record profits, your stock price has rebounded, your company is the most admired manufacturer in America, et cetera, et cetera. And what Bill told me is, he said, I still can't sleep at night because I'm worried that we're going to become victims of our own success, that we're going to get complacent. And that when we do, we're going to slip right back to where we were. Well, it turns out that was a very prescient thing for Bill Ford to say, because if you look at where Ford is at today, even before the COVID-19 crisis began, they had slipped exactly back to where they were before all of this turnaround began. But this conversation got me thinking about, there must be a methodology, there must be a way for companies to avoid this. There must be a way for companies to intentionally disrupt themselves before they are disrupted by external competitors or external events. And that's what led me to go down this path of exploring red teaming, because one of the things that I firmly believe is that most businesses die from self-inflicted wounds. Most businesses die from self-inflicted wounds. And if you just look at these logos on your screen here, and there's so many more you could add to this, these companies were not put out of business by competitors. They were put out of business by their own mistakes. And people will say, well, Kodak was a victim of the fact that photography switched from chemical-based photography to digital photography. But what people forget is that Kodak actually invented the digital camera. So they can't really blame a new technology on putting them out of business, because they invented that technology. So what Kodak's failure was to understand the potential of that technology and how to use it. So this is why I think it's so important, this idea of deliberate disruption, of disrupting yourself as an organization before you are disrupted by external events. So that's what convinced me to spend the first half of 2015 becoming the first and still only civilian to graduate from the U.S. Army's Red Team Leader course at beautiful Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And you can tell me in the graduating class here, because I'm the only person not wearing camouflage to the graduation ceremony. I must have missed the memo. And after that, I spent the next year taking what I had learned there, also working with the British military, which was a big adopter of red teaming as well, the Australian military, New Zealand military, and intelligence agencies around the world, to learn how they were doing these techniques, and then porting it to business. And in 2017, I wrote my latest book, Red Teaming, which is designed to teach companies how to use these tools in the same way that militaries and intelligence organizations were using them. So why do we need red teaming as businesses? Well, we need red teaming because we have entered an era of unprecedented, and I'm going to use an acronym that's starting to gain a lot of currency in business schools, at least in the United States, VUCA. VUCA, for those who haven't encountered this term yet, stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. In other words, it stands for how business exists today, the environment we all live in today, even before the coronavirus came, but certainly since. And in that environment, we see new threats and this is important, new opportunities emerging every day. But the tools that we have are not really well suited for dealing with this. So let me share a few quotes with you that I think really underscore why we need red team thinking in business. So this quote, for people who aren't familiar with Joe Cassano, was the head of AIG. And what he's referring to in these transactions that they could not possibly lose a single dollar from was their underwriting of the subprime mortgage-backed securities that turned out to not only cost AIG more than $1, turned out to bankrupt AIG, and in doing so, bringing down the entire global economy. Why I think this quote is so important is this. This is not from a press release. This is not from an analyst call. This is not from an interview. It's not from a town hall meeting. It is from a confidential internal email that Joe sent to the other senior members of AIG 6 months before this house of cards that they had built on these investments fell down and brought the rest of the world's economy down with it. So this is a really powerful insight into the lies we tell ourselves as organizations, as leaders. Here's another quote. This was from a press conference. I don't know how many of you are still using Microsoft smartphones, but this again speaks to this idea of the arrogance that is bred by success. And it's ironic that Steve Ballmer said this, because one of my favorite quotes about this danger of success is from his business partner, Bill Gates, who famously said that success is a poor teacher. We learn a lot more from our failures than we do from success. Obviously, Microsoft did not take that to heart when it came to the smartphone market. And then finally, this quote, which is so timely today as all of us are glued to our Netflix service. This quote is from an analyst call. And Jim Keyes, who is the CEO of Blockbuster, was responding in this case to a question from a Wall Street analyst who was asking, what is your strategy for responding to Netflix and Redbox? And look at the date on this. This is 2008. For those of you who remember, if you cast your mind back there, Netflix was not a startup in 2008. They already had a huge number of customers, at least in the United States, that had signed up for their service. And yet the response from the CEO of Blockbuster was, we don't even need to have a strategy to respond to them. Here's a fun fact. Just before this quote, a few months before this, Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, flew down with his team to Texas to meet with Jim Keyes and his team with a proposition. They said, look, the future of video is going to be online, and it's going to be online streaming and distribution. We all know it. So rather than battle each other in the marketplace, here's what we propose. We'll sell our company to you for $50 million, and we'll help you take Blockbuster and make it into Netflix. It'll be an online only service. They were literally laughed out of Blockbuster's headquarters. When Blockbuster went bankrupt a few years later, Netflix was worth $23.5 billion. So talk about missing the boat. Now, it's easy to look at these quotes and think, boy, these people are colossally stupid. But they are not. These are smart people who got to the positions that they were because of their abilities, because of their business chops. The problem is that they fell victim to something that all of us fall victim to, and it really comes down to this idea that Adam Smith was wrong. For 3 centuries, economists, cognitive psychologists, people who looked at the way people make decisions, believed that Adam Smith's rational choice theory was the way we thought, the way we made decisions as people, as human beings. And what Adam Smith said is that people make the best decision they possibly can based on the information that they have. So if they make a bad decision, it's not because they didn't think through it correctly, it's because they didn't have enough information. So, he would argue that Blockbuster didn't know that people were going to switch and didn't want to come into a store to get their videos anymore. The problem with that is that that's not actually how people make decisions. For the past 45 years, cognitive psychologists like Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his in economics for his work in this area, and others have conducted literally tens of thousands of experiments. And what all of those experiments prove is that that's not how we really make decisions. That really our brain is as he describes it, a machine for jumping to conclusions. And what he and other researchers have uncovered is this dizzying array of cognitive biases and blind spots that skew our thinking in ways that we're not even aware of. And this is a fascinating area of study, which I won't go into in great detail, but I just want to give you an idea of a few of these so you understand what I'm talking about. Affect heuristic is one that's very powerful on people. And basically what it is that people, all of us, no matter how smart we are, no matter how well educated we are, no matter how successful we are more likely to give weight in our decision making to data that is emotionally charged, whether it's positive or negative. And there's all sorts of examples of this. One of the things that I find to be a really kind of graphic example of this is in the United States, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, a huge number of people decided not to fly on airplanes domestically and to drive instead because they were afraid that the planes would be hijacked again, despite the fact that we now have this massive security apparatus in place. And despite the fact that there's tons of data out there that's readily available, it shows that driving is far more dangerous than flying, even with terrorism factored into it. Well, a group of scientists actually sifted through the data for the next year, and they found that in the 6 months after September 11th, more Americans were killed because they chose not to fly and drive instead than were killed in all of the terrorist attacks on 9/11 combined. Another one is loss aversion, and this is something that affects companies in a big way. So I put up Polaroid's logo on my list of companies that died from self-inflicted wounds. Again, people misunderstand why Polaroid went out of business. Polaroid went out of business because of loss aversion, and loss aversion is the tendency that we all have to that we would rather avoid a loss than reap a greater reward. And they've done really kind of troubling experiments to prove this. They do things like where they give a child a candy bar and they let them unwrap it and take a bite of it. And so they have a candy bar that's now missing a bite, and they say, right, in the hallway outside this door, you might have noticed when you came in, Johnny, is a vending machine that has the exact same candy bar in it. And they're 50 cents. I'll give you $1. You can buy 2 of them if you give me that candy bar. Most children will say, no, I want to keep the candy bar that I've got, even though it's got a bite out of it, and even though I could get 2 more, because they already have it. Now, it's easy to see how a child would do that, but look at how companies do this. Polaroid, again, did not go out of business because it didn't understand digital photography. Polaroid actually had developed one of the best-selling digital cameras in the market. But what Polaroid did was they looked at their business, and you can look at all this because after they went bankrupt, their board minutes were opened up. Polaroid looked at their business and they said, right, we've got these digital cameras and they're very cool and they were selling more every month, but we only make about 15, 20% margin on these. It's not bad at all, but look at our film. We make over 70% margin on our film. And if we keep selling these digital cameras, we're selling less film. And this film is a really tasty candy bar, and we don't want to give it up. So they decided to kill their digital photography business because it was undercutting their film business. Now, this obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. There were plenty of other companies that were selling digital cameras at the same time, and all Polaroid succeeded in doing was ceding their market share to them and accelerating their decline, and they went bankrupt a few years later. But that's why they did. And then I'll just one more. This is one of my favorites, optimism bias. What optimism bias shows is that, again, all of us underestimate our shortcomings, overestimate our abilities, and exaggerate our chances of accurately predicting the future. That becomes a real problem when you're trying to make business decisions. Here's another fun fact. 93% of Americans believe they are above average drivers. Now, it's easy to look at that and say, well, obviously 93% of Americans are not very sophisticated thinkers if they believe that, but they've done similar studies of college professors. And in the US and the UK, they've surveyed college professors at a number of major universities, and guess what they found? The vast majority of college professors believe that they are above average instructors, even professors of statistics who should know better. Now, these things affect individuals, but when you get individuals into a group like a company, all of these biases and blind spots get magnified, and then you get a whole additional array of kind of pathologies that develop that affect decision making in negative ways in organizations. Things like groupthink, things like satisficing, which is which is really the way that most organizations make decisions, which is simply when you're given a problem, the CEO, your boss says, right, we need to do X. You work till you find the first possible solution, and then you go with that without looking further to see if there's a better solution. That's called satisficing. The Abilene paradox, which is what psychologists call when we say yes when we mean no. And then you add to that internal politics and careerism and all of that. And all of these things really have a profoundly negative impact on our ability to make good decisions as organizations. So a quote from General Patton that I think is really relevant to this. If everybody is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. And too often in organizations, that's exactly what's happening. So what does this have to do with red team thinking? Well, red team thinking is designed to deal with all of these issues. It offers tools to counter unconscious biases, and it offers techniques to surface alternative perspectives, to force you as an individual and as an organization to challenge your assumptions. And this is really important, to leverage the wisdom of the group to overcome the blind spots of the individual and identify as many options as possible and ensure that the best idea wins, regardless of where it comes from within your organization. So how do we do this? I'm just going to give you, there's a lot of tools and techniques that are part of the Red Team Thinking Toolkit, and we don't have time to cover them all, but I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of what some of them are. And then I will give you some information about how to use some of these tools right now in dealing with the stuff that you may be dealing with in your organization today. So the first group of tools we have are what we call analytical techniques. And these include tools like what we call an assumptions challenge, which is a very robust technique for identifying all of the stated and unstated assumptions in your strategy or plan, and then stress testing each of these individual assumptions to make sure that they are really sound enough to base your strategy on. The second group of methods that we use are what we call imaginative techniques. And these include things like pre-mortem analysis, which some of you may have heard of, which are designed to figure out how plans could go wrong, not because you're being negative or second guessing yourself, but to figure out how your plan could go wrong in order to figure out how you could modify it before you execute it to increase its chances of success. And also another one that's really important right now, alternative futures analysis, which is a systematic way of looking at the different ways that a strategy, a plan, or a decision could unfold against different future states when the future is uncertain. And then finally, we have a group of techniques that we call contrarian techniques. And these are things, this goes to the devil's advocacy. These are designed to really stress test your strategies and your plans before you commit, to make sure that the course of action you're moving forward with is really the best course of action. And also other tools like the enemy within, which are designed to make sure that your organization is not doing things that are going to defeat itself as you move forward with a particular plan or course of action. So this is just really a quick overview of some of the tools and techniques that we teach and use. So I'll give you a few examples of how we use these. So for instance, we've worked with one of the largest banks on Wall Street to spend a couple of days with them stress testing a $1 trillion strategy that they were preparing to roll out an entirely new line of business And in the course of just spending 2 half days using these techniques, they found a potentially fatal flaw in that strategy. They decided to slam on the brakes, to delay its rollout for 6 months. They revised the strategy to obviate the concern that it had surfaced. They've since executed it. They're making billions of dollars off of it, and they haven't run into the problem that they would have run into if they hadn't discovered it beforehand. We've also worked with one of the largest airlines in the world, using techniques to help them better understand how their code share partners and their joint venture partners could better become partners in their own success and better integrate them as part of a global network of carriers, rather than telling them what to do, getting their ideas using some of these techniques and incorporating the ideas of their partners into their own strategy. We worked with one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in Asia, and we taught a group of their senior executives how to use these tools and techniques to vet investment decisions. And they use red team thinking now before they make a big bet on a company, to look at how the strategy could go wrong and modify the conditions of their investment to make sure it doesn't. And then finally, the last example that I'll give you is we've worked with one of the largest telecommunications companies in this world to train a series of actual red teams within the organization, so that they have a standing in-house capability to use on all of their major strategies, which they now do on all strategies over a certain dollar value before they go to the board of directors for approval. So this is just give you an example of some of the different ways that this is played out in business. And the way that we do this is through, we have basically 4 different things we do, most of which have rapidly shifted to online in the past few weeks. But as I mentioned with the last example, we train companies that want to have a formal red teaming capability. We provide training for them to set up and support those red teams. We also do workshops for individuals, open enrollment workshops, which we're now doing online for people who just want to learn more themselves about this, so that they can use these tools and techniques themselves. And for companies that don't want to have a red team, but want to use red teaming on a major strategy or plan, we offer facilitation. Right now, for instance, we're working with one of the largest paper companies in the world to look at a key strategy that they have before they go to market with it, and kind of stress test it to make sure it's the right thing. And then the other thing is I do things like I'm doing right now, which is just talking with folks like you about how this works. So I want to close by giving you some ideas of how you can take this and use this right now in your organization dealing with the present crisis. Because right now it's really all about resiliency. And when I talk about resiliency, I mean emotional resiliency, cognitive resiliency, and strategic resiliency. Now, most people know what emotional resiliency is, but when I speak of cognitive resiliency, it comes to this issue of needing new ways of thinking about problems in order to navigate through this kind of crazy time that we're in. And strategic resiliency is about developing strategies that can really survive this. So how do you do that? Well, just at a very simple level, some things you can do right now. The first is leverage the wisdom of your team. There's a famous Japanese proverb that says, none of us is as smart as all of us. And that's very true. And it's more true at times like this than ever, because right now, there are people in your organization who know what your organization needs to do to get through this and what it needs to stop doing in order to get through this. So what I've been suggesting to my clients right now is that create an online suggestion box, make it anonymous, and ask 3 questions of your people. What should we be doing that we're not right now? What should we stop doing that we are doing? And what should we double down on? Where should we be focusing our organization? I think if you do this, you'll be really surprised at the results. The second thing is I would urge you to examine the assumptions you're making right now as an organization as you look to move forward in this very complex environment. and come up with a list of both your stated and unstated assumptions, and ask yourself two questions. How confident are you that these assumptions will prove true? And which of these assumptions pose the biggest risk to your success? Which of these, if they're wrong, could really derail what you're planning? And then focus on those and really try to analyze them and make sure that they're likely to prove true, because the assumptions ideally are simply facts that are not yet true, but will be soon. The third thing I would recommend, and this is kind of like a pre-mortem light, is contemplate failure. Ask yourself, what is the worst that could happen? And then ask yourself, what are the things that would lead to that failed state? Write them down as a list. And then look and ask yourself, right, what could we do right now to reduce the chances of these things happening, to mitigate these things if they do happen, and to prevent them from leading to the failed state that we imagined? And finally, play the devil's advocate. Before you commit to a course of action, ask yourself, what other levers could we pull to accomplish this? And try your best to develop at least two different alternative courses of action. And then look at these and ask yourself, which of these is the best option? Or is there a way I could combine elements from two or three of these and come up with a fourth way that's better than all three of them? These are just some simple things that you can do to use a little bit of red team thinking right now to deal with the present crisis. So that's all I have. I'm hoping that we can spend the rest of the time just talking. I'd love to take your questions.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Bryce. Very, very interesting stuff, and hopefully some good catalyst there for some discussion. I should say at the beginning, we have, if you type a question into the Q&A or the chat box, then I can ask that to Bryce, and yeah, build on the discussion so far. I might abuse my position as a co-panelist to maybe ask the first question on. I suppose one of my sort of things about the devil's advocate sort of point, and generally around red teaming, is, I suppose, how does one actually get to a conclusion? Because I think that, you know, every strategy has its weaknesses. There are always better ideas, but you know, as you know, businesses ultimately have to run processes and have to make decisions. And what might be a great idea to improve something might be completely unworkable. What's the sort of, how do you help people move towards decision making as well as purely red teaming?
Great question, James. So one of the things that we teach people, whether we're teaching people individually or as organizations, is that red team thinking can never be allowed to defer or delay a decision when the decision has to be made. One of my other favorite quotes from General Patton, besides the one I shared, is that a good plan violently executed today is better than a great plan a week from now. And there's a lot of truth to that. But people forget the rest of that quote, which is that a plan that hasn't been evaluated is worse than no plan at all. And so it's really important to strike a balance between looking at your plans and strategies and acting when action is required. And the way that we do this is really simple. First off, most of the time when we're working with folks, there is a deadline. A decision has to be made by a certain date, a certain time. It may be tomorrow, it may be a month from now, it may be a year from now. So the red teaming that's done around that will be determined by when that decision has to be made. If there's not a deadline, we teach people you have to set a deadline for yourself. You have to make a decision before you begin a red teaming process of, right, we're going to spend 2 hours looking at this. We're going to spend 2 days. We're going to spend 2 weeks, whatever it is. But you make a deadline for yourself because you don't want to fall victim to analysis paralysis. The other thing I'll say is that since my book came out in 2017, we've been doing this with a lot of companies around the world. And we constantly eat our own dog food. We red team ourselves. And as a result of that, we have really changed. Red teaming as we do it today, as we teach it today, as we lead it today, is very different from how it's described in my book, to be honest. because what we've learned is that in the military and in the intelligence world, the idea of having a formal team is very powerful. But in business, to your point, James, people need to make decisions more quickly. So what we've evolved to, and the reason why we call it red team thinking now, as opposed to red teaming, is taking these concepts, taking the thinking behind the formal process of red teaming, and evolving it to the point where people can do this quickly. They can do it with ad hoc teams, informally. They can grab a couple of people, bring them together, spend a couple of hours, an hour even, looking at stuff, using some of the tools and techniques we teach. And it doesn't have to be this long process that requires a lot of training and a lot of time to evaluate.
Very interesting. Next question is on the you gave some obviously some good and famous examples: Blockbuster, Netflix, Kodak, and digital film. One could argue they were in fairly long term. It's what we call a slow car crash. You could see there was going to be a shift from chemical film to digital. You could see that it was DVDs now, but when broadband was improved, it would be streaming in a couple of years' time. And hindsight is always a good lens to look at these things. I'd be really interested, and you wrote your book, I suppose, in many ways in the context of that kind of world. You wrote your book 3 years ago. How have the last 3 or 4 weeks changed your view of kind of resilience? Because I think no one really, I haven't met anyone who would have ever thought this. I know Bill Gates did his talk on pathogens in 2015, but no one really was seriously thinking we'd have a global lockdown like this. How has your thinking maybe evolved from your beach apartment or beach house, probably?
So it's a great question. 2 things I'll say on that. One is, I think that more people did see this coming than we think. I was just speaking yesterday with the subject of my first book, Al Mulally, the former CEO of Ford and the former CEO of Boeing, legendary turnaround leader. And he was telling me that he was on a group that we call in the United States the Business Roundtable, which advises the president on business. And he was served on this under 2 administrations, under President Bush and under President Obama, Republican, Democrat. And he told me that one of the jobs of the Business Roundtable was to kind of tell the President of the United States, here are some things that we are concerned about as business leaders that could happen, that the country has to prepare for. And one of them, he said, that was on that list the entire time that he was on the Business Roundtable for 20 years almost, was a pandemic caused by a respiratory virus coming out of China. And it's because people saw SARS, they saw these things happening, and they knew that there was a potential for this. So not on the scale that we're talking about, but I think it's important to realize that this shouldn't have been the surprise that it was to people. In this country, we had teams of scientists up until a year and a half ago working on developing a vaccine for a coronavirus. Because of advice like this, we had stockpiles of medical equipment and stuff that were being maintained that all stopped in the past year and a half, 2 years, unfortunately. So I just throw that out there because I think one of the things that it's easy to do in times like this is say, well, nobody could have seen this coming, but a lot of people did.
Yeah.
But to your point, most of us didn't. And what the past few weeks have done for me have really underscored just how essential these tools and techniques are. And that's, we're actually, I was talking with someone yesterday, they said, I'm so bored right now. Things are so slow. I haven't been busier than I am right now in months, because so many companies and so many leaders around the world are looking at what we're doing and saying, this is exactly what I need to figure out how to move forward in this. So again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, a lot of the tools and techniques that we learned in business school for making decisions are just not well suited to this world.
Yeah.
And these techniques were developed for a very different world. They were developed for a world of the global war on terror, of the wars in the Middle East and things like this. And they are designed to help people navigate very complex environments that are shifting day by day under their feet. And they're really designed to give leaders at every level of an organization the confidence to move forward, to make decisions in a world where you can't be sure that the future is going to look what the future is going to look like tomorrow. So I think it's actually really proved the value and gone from being something that's good to have to being something that's essential to have.
Yeah. Which leads on to actually the next question, which is, what's your advice to leaders, and that's governments or business leaders or just team leaders, around balancing what a lot of people are doing, which is sort of on the urgent side is dealing and putting out fires, which are unwinding contracts, fixing problems, getting through the new normal, and then balance that with headspace to think about the future scenarios and a clear vision for what that future might kind of look like. How do you, so any tips and tricks for sort of making time to think longer term, slow decision making?
Yeah, well, that's a fabulous and such an important question. So one of the things that, look, if your house is burning down, you got to call the fire department. Don't get me wrong, you have to put out fires. But here is something that I firmly believe that I have been, this is kind of what I've been preaching for more years than I can remember. It's very simple. Bad leaders react, good leaders plan, and great leaders think. If you are reactive, if you let events drive your decision making, you are going to make bad decisions. Period, dot, end of sentence. You cannot allow events to drive your decision making. You have to respond to events, but you have to be able to do so in a thoughtful way. And so the way you can do it, I think, is that a lot of the tools and techniques that we teach, you can do them in 15, 30, 45 minutes. You don't need a lot of time to use these techniques. The more time you can spend on it, obviously, the more benefit you get. It's kind of like going to the gym, is how I was just telling the CEO this the other day. If you go to the gym 1 day a week, you're not going to be as fit as somebody who goes 6 days a week, but you're going to be a lot more fit than somebody who doesn't go to the gym at all. So what we've done is we've scaled these techniques so that you can use them in as little or as long a time as you have. But it's almost like practicing mindfulness. Simply stepping back and saying, right, before I pull the trigger on this, I'm going to take 30 minutes. I'm going to pick one or two of these tools and I'm going to use them. I'm going to grab a couple people that I trust, or I'm going to use them by myself.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to take a hard look at this before I move forward. Just doing that will change the way that you think about these things. A lot of the tools that we teach are all based on this cognitive psychology that I talked about, and they're designed to overcome these biases, to force our brains to literally think differently so that we can come up with a different perspective on the problem. And maybe our gut instinct was right, but just doing this will help us have the confidence that it was right before we move forward.
Yeah, I think the general the feeling we get is it's about a mindset of red teaming and just culturally embedding that in the business. I remember there was a British general in Afghanistan in sort of 2005 who said, I like plan B soldiers, people who can always be, plan A never happens. So we need to be good with people who can deal with a plan B and not be surprised when that happens.
Well, you're absolutely right, James. Just on that point, because I think it's really important. The people who created red teaming in the U.S. Army will tell you that the secret is that while it was officially created to come up with this formal process of having a stress testing the military strategies before they were executed, the real reason it was created was to change the culture of the organization. And the idea was that if you make it a requirement that every strategy has to be red teamed, and you create billets, you create a certain number of positions at every level of the Army where officers have to be trained in these tools, that what you do over time is create a huge percentage of your officer corps who are exposed to these tools, who have, to your point, James, the red teaming mindset, and that is going to pay bigger dividends as they move forward in their careers and become more senior leaders than the formal process itself. Absolutely right.
Yeah. And then she's got a question here from Rick, which is, hello, Bryce. Have you applied red team thinking to challenge organizational culture strategies?
Absolutely.
Can you give us an example? Thank you.
Absolutely. So one company that we work with, and it's very timely to one of the previous questions, they describe themselves as having a firefighting culture. that the mindset of the organization was we rush to a fire.
Yeah, yeah.
The problem with rushing to a fire is that you're doing no long-term thinking. Everything is reactive. Everything is about stamping out the embers that are spreading. And if that's your business culture, you're going to avoid the catastrophe that's right in front of your nose, but you're going to do nothing to set yourself up for future success. So we worked with this company. We've worked with them now for 3 years, and training a group of executives, of kind of low-level executives, every year in these tools and techniques to develop this mindset. And what it's done is it's changed their strategic planning process, so that now they're not just putting out fires, they're making time to do forward-thinking exercises. So for instance, they now schedule twice a year, they schedule a session in their strategy group to look at red teaming their competitors, to look at, if our competitor is going to put us out of business in the next 2 years, how are they going to do it, for instance, is one of the things that we've taught them how to do. And then taking those learnings and incorporating them into their strategic planning. So they're moving from putting out fires to avoiding fires, which is much more powerful.
Yeah. We had this one, might be one more here from Alan. What companies do you think today are the best at red team thinking, and why? So are there kind of organizations, companies who are kind of embedded it well, and it's used as a method, and it seems to be effective? I remember I went to a talk once from a guy talking about Pixar, and how at that point, probably 5 years ago, they'd never made a bad film. And it's because they had a very open, critical culture from all the top people there. What are your thoughts?
So this is a tough question for me to answer because of NDAs. I can't talk about a lot of the companies that I work with, but I will tell you, I will tell you this. When I'd learned about red teaming, before I decided to give up half of a year and move to Kansas and join the Army for 6 months, I wanted to make sure that other people thought this was a good idea, not just me. And so I shared what I'd learned about red teaming with a number of friends who were in senior positions at different companies. And one of my friends was an executive at Amazon. And when I told him about red teaming, I described some of the techniques to him. He said, you know what? He said, this is really, really interesting. He said, I've never heard the term red teaming in Amazon. Outside of cybersecurity, some people may have encountered the term there, which is where you have kind of white hat hackers try to break into your networks before the black hat hackers. He said, other than that, I've never heard the term red teaming in Amazon. But I can tell you that what you've just described to me, the tools that you've described to me, are exactly how we do things. We don't do it in such a formal process because it's just part of our DNA. But he went on to describe to me about how most people don't realize this. Amazon has, like a lot of companies, benchmarking teams, but they have internal benchmarking teams that basically benchmark themselves and figure out how, if they were a competitor, would they do what they're doing better? How would they disrupt themselves? Which is what red teaming is all about at a certain level. They also have this process that many people probably who've studied Amazon are probably familiar with because it's been written about a lot over the past 10 years, which is these 6-page memos. And it's a very formal process that Bezos has developed. You are allowed and encouraged as an executive to challenge anything that Amazon does. But before you do so, you have to present your case in a 6-page memo. And there's a format for the memos. They have to contain certain things. They have to be laid out in a certain way. And before you can present your memo to the senior leadership team, it has to be red teamed. You're assigned a mentor. You're assigned someone else who's already presented one of these memos. And they go through and they take your memo and they rip it apart, the first draft. And they say, you know what? Jeff is going to say, you're an idiot because of this, and where's the data that proves this? One of the key rules is all the memos have to be fact-based. They have to be backed up by data. And so you go through this process, and when your red teamer, your mentor, is satisfied that your memo is ready for prime time, so to speak, then you're allowed to present it. And at each of Amazon senior leadership meetings, they have time set aside. This is very interesting. This goes to the idea of great leaders think rather than plan or react. Bezos decided early on that if you send people these memos in an email, they won't read them. They'll say they read them, but they won't read them. So what does he do? He sets aside 30 minutes in his leadership meeting every week for whatever memo is being presented that week. The senior leaders and him have to read the memo together silently in the room together to make sure that everybody reads it, and then they discuss it. And my friend told me, this is why we are so successful, is practices like these. And he said, you know, again, we don't call it red teaming, but it's exactly the type of thing you're talking about. And he said, it was really interesting. He said, you know, I'm always asked when I meet people at conferences and stuff, and they learn that I'm an executive at Amazon, I'm asked by old economy companies all the time, how can we be more like Amazon? And he said, I always feel like a bit of a jerk, because what I want to tell them is, well, you could start over, because this stuff is so hardwired into our culture. You know, we did this back when we were working out of a garage, essentially. But he said, this is the first thing, red teaming is the first thing I've seen that I could recommend to a company to make it more like Amazon. So that's I think a great example to look at.
And one of the things you sort of flagged earlier was in one of your slides around careerists and, I suppose, bits of being political, you know, within a corporate structure. So this is one of the challenges of red team. It might be, you know, you've got a team of 10 people or 15 people, and yes, you can give them the mindset and give them the tools to do pre-mortems or devil's advocate, but those power lines exist. Like, there's an accountability for the product manager. They are in charge of that product management, and therefore at the end of the day, they get fired if it doesn't deliver. How do you kind of, or is it not really about competition in that way? Is it about just being really collaborative? How do you kind of navigate the power lines, which have to kind of exist in any sort of team structure, be it a scrum or a management team, whatever else?
Yeah, so this is very important. First off, red teaming is a team-based activity, ideally.
Okay.
You can use these tools and techniques individually, but it's designed to work in a team-based collaborative environment. That's where it really is most valuable. And you can use these tools and techniques individually as a leader to make better decisions yourself. And we've worked with people who are very successful at this. But what we tell them is, if your senior leadership has not bought into this, then don't do it publicly. Because red teaming as a public exercise only works with buy-in from senior leadership.
Yeah.
It only works with buy-in from senior leadership. So if you're in an organization where the organization wants to do better and knows it can do better, and there's a receptivity to finding ways to do things better, this is transformational. It's incredibly powerful. But one of the first things that they taught us when I was in the Army learning this is, you can't red team in the fear bunker. You know, you can't red team in the fear bunker. You know, so if you're in an organization where the CEO has got all the answers and you know, doesn't need anyone to tell her or him, you know, how to do things, they've already got it sorted out, they've cracked the code. It's best not to do this except on you know, privately and for your own part of the business.
Yes, absolutely. Now, sadly, I think we've almost hit our full hour. So therefore forced me to thank you. Well, first of all, thank all of our audience out there around the world, around the UK, around Europe. Thank you so much for signing up and joining us this afternoon. Really great to have you there. A huge thank you to Bryce for historical tour de force on red team thinking, whizzing forward to the present day and the present months, and hopefully some really interesting thoughts and concepts and methods that we can employ in ourselves and teams to navigate what is going to be a very tricky time. But ever the optimistic firm, we're very much excited about the future. It will be a very different one, I'm sure. But yeah, it's certainly worth looking at the plan a little bit more as we kind of navigate forward. So thanks so much, Bryce, and thank you to you all. Have lovely mornings for Bryce and afternoons to you in the UK and Europe. Thank you.
Thank you.